question I had. I was watching a bunch of videos.
Uh-huh.
And surgical gloves. A lot of them were wearing the blue surgical gloves. Can the bee not sting through the...
Once in a while they can. Yeah.
I just thought that was a bit of more dexterity there.
Yeah, I mean, it's so close proximity to your fingers. If you get like a guard bee or something like that, yeah, they can kind of get through it.
Get through that.
hmm The reason they use them is because they fit so well on your fingers and you're so agile with them. Whereas those gloves are a little more cumbersome because they're so thick. So when you're picking out gloves, try to get a size that fits really snug. And even with that, sometimes they'll get through that leather. But it's rare.
Now, is that cowhide, goat hide?
They come in cowhide, pig hide, goat hide. The goat skin is typically the best, or pig skin if you can find them. They're the toughest. Yeah.
Do you wear all of them, or a lot of them don't?
I do, just simply because your face is so delicate. I don't mind getting stung anywhere else, but in your face is challenging.
I did do the hat thing, but the
Yeah.
hands thing. Now, I had one. I went out to give them sugar water the other day, and I didn't have anything on, and I had one go in my ear.
Yeah, once in a while you can.
I just stood there, and it's like, okay, you can back out now, and it did. I
Yeah,
just stood there.
yeah.
It's like,
And that's the best thing to do is not panic, because when you panic, everything changes. Yeah. All right. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear okay in the very back? Everybody good to hear? Can you hear all right, Al? All right. What a nice class. Good to have you with us on this rainy Saturday morning. I hope one day it gets summertime. This cool spring has been challenging, and certainly challenging for the bees. Anybody seen swarms this week? Anybody at all? So they should kick in gear with the weather change that's coming up the first part of the week. I am seeing some posts locally where there is some swarming going on. This rain gets out of here and the cooler temperatures rise, we should see that really go to town. So if you're trying to catch a swarm or in swarming business, your day's coming soon, so be prepared. Any questions from the last couple of weeks before we get started today? Any at all? So this lady here at the first table asked me about the blue latex style gloves that you see, especially doctors and nurses wearing. A lot of beekeepers like to use that. How effective are they? They can be a little challenging. I think honeybees can, especially a guard bee that is designed to be more protective of the hive, can penetrate those. The reason they use those is because they're so tight fitting and your fingers are so much more agile and you can do so much more. Whereas the regular bee glove, which is a little safer, has a tendency to be more cumbersome, so handling is a little more challenging. So it's your risk, and whatever you want to do, whenever you're buying gloves, just make sure they fit really nice and snug on your fingers, and they're not a size too big where they're too big for handling purposes. Any questions at all? Yes, sir.
So I saw a blog post the other day where a guy was making his own foundation, and he was talking about making his cell sizes bigger. His logic was he made bigger bees that were hardier, blah, blah, blah. Is there any science behind that at all?
There is. So let me tell you what's going on with that. I used to know the size of this cell, but I can't quote that right now. But what I will tell you, that we thought, as scientists, we thought we were being brilliant a few years ago, and I'm talking 10 or 15 years ago. And we began producing this foundation with a smaller cell size. The thought behind that was more cells, more production. The challenge to that is it's not original as what the bees intend to have. If you go to a bee tree and you compare the size of the wax cells that they build out compared to this, the wax cell that they build out is a lot larger. So Mother Nature, we think sometimes we're smarter than Mother Nature. What this guy is doing is he's trying to go back to what the original bee design by the nature of the bee was. And we're actually starting to see some of these foundation companies go back to that. It makes it much more effective as far as the size of your bee, how much the bees can actually feed the larva, etc. So he's on target, and he's doing what he knows is right, because that's the natural way that it should be done by the world of beekeeping. We think that we're a lot more intelligent, so we try to design that. You'll also notice that these cells, in the same way in a bee tree, they're a little bit longer at the top side of the cell than they are at the bottom side, so they're drawn out just a tad more, and the reason for that is water. So the water will run off and not back into the cell. Water has a tendency to spoil and causes all kinds of problem inside the hive or inside the cell. So there's really unique design to what they're doing. That's why the honeybee is such a fascinating creature, because they know exactly how to build out those cells, what to do with it, the size to do with it. I mean, it's pretty amazing to learn and to watch. Anybody else? Good gosh, I know I didn't do that good a job. All right. Today we're going to talk about pest and disease management. When I was a young man, a day or two ago, my grandfather always had 7 to 10 hives of bees. That's where I got initiated and fell in love with beekeeping. When I look back over that, what I realized was that my grandfather never put a strip of any kind of chemical in his hive, never saw him feed his bees, never saw him do anything to treat or protect the bees. And I said that to say this. I mean, every spring he'd go out there when the time was right and put a honey super on. When they filled it up, he'd pull the super, put a new one on, rob them, and he produced a lot of honey through the year. And that was basically his management practice. Over the years, we've been so inundated with disease and pest that if you're going to be a successful beekeeper, you're going to have a integrated pest management program. You have just got to be deliberate with that. One of the keys to being a successful beekeeper is being proactive and not being reactive. So a pest management program built into your dialogue of beekeeping is a must. Today, the honeybee is under such an enormous attack from disease and pest, particularly pest. Disease is pretty much under control, a little bit more or better now than it ever has been, but pests are a real problem. And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the pest side of beekeeping. I do want to reflect a little bit on diseases. You can go online and look and get real thorough knowledge on the diseases that have been out there and that are still out there. But I want to touch briefly on them and visit with you about them a little bit and answer any questions you might have, because you're not totally protected against them. It's very rare that we see some of these diseases anymore. Back in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, some of these diseases were real prominent. Today, these queens have been bred in such a manner that they've become a little more resistant, and the bees are a lot more resistant now. Actually, what we're dealing with most of all is a hybrid bee instead of the old original, what we used to see like my grandfather did. So there has been a lot of improvements, and we see some improvements in the beekeeping industry against some of the pests as well, like the Tracheal Mite. And the Varroa Mite is still a challenge, and they haven't really been able to address that, or have not yet addressed that in a manner that they can breed into these queens the ability to resist or ward off. But the Tracheal Mite they have. So we'll talk about the Tracheal Mite, and particularly talk about the Varroa Mite, because that is a real huge issue. So let me side note real quick, because my mind's kind of scattered this morning a little bit. How many have got their bees so far already? So your old ones, but you've got new ones coming. How many are ordering one nuke? How many are ordering more than one? Okay, So Nixa Hardware, they originally had a capacity of 300 nukes to sell. They've met that capacity. They've talked to their supplier. The supplier has said, hey, we've got another 50 that we can allow you to have. So they still have some nukes available, probably through this week, maybe into the early part of next week. But I ask you that, and I'm said that to say this to you. If you're a new beekeeper, I always encourage new beekeepers, if they can, and if they can afford to, get 2 nukes. Start out with 2 hives. The reason for that is, with 1 hive, it's really hard to gauge how well that hive is doing. You don't have anything to compare it against. Okay? If you have 2 hives sitting side by side, and honestly, 2 hives are not much more trouble than 1 as far as timeline and taking care of them. It is an additional expense. You're actually going to basically double your expense of investment. But side by side, you can see how each hive is doing and use that kind of as a comparison to help you gauge. This hive may be a little weaker, this hive may be stronger. And that kind of gives you a rule of thumb to go by, kind of a roadmap. The other thing is, if something happens that you happen to lose one of them hives for whatever reason, you still have a hive that you're not out of the business with. Okay? Any questions there? That's just a recommendation. You can take that and $1 and buy a cup of coffee at McDonald's every day. Okay? Okay, let's go back now, circle back to diseases. There's 2 types of bee diseases. There is the disease that affects the brood, and there's the disease that affects the adult bee. One of the worst, and I'll start off with the worst, one of the worst diseases we've ever seen in the beekeeping industry is called the American foul brood. The American foul brood disease actually kills the larva of the queen as she puts it in the cell. When you see the queen cells, and we've saw pictures, that queen cell, or that cell, when it's sealed over, is pretty well flat, or sometimes may have a little rise to it. When the disease of American foul brood hits that hive, what you'll notice is the cell is sunken in. The covering over that cell is sunk in, and it'll turn a real dark brown color. It'll have perforated holes in it, like somebody stuck pin needles in it. And the biggest thing that will set it off, when you open that hive, the stench is unbelievable. Terrible, terrible stink. You think a skunk's bad, wait till you get into a hive of American foul brood. It's awful. And you'll recognize that immediately. One of the true tests to see if you have American foul brood is you can take a toothpick or a matchstick, and if you stick it in that cell and you draw it out, it'll have a stringy effect to it. So there'll be kind of a liquid stringy come out of that cell. That's American foul brood. So if you ever have, and I haven't seen a case of American foul brood in 10 years. I've heard of a couple of cases in the last 3-4 years, but I've not actually physically seen that. If you have American foul brood, you have to call your state beekeeping inspector and report it, because it's a highly contagious disease and it will affect your other hives, especially if you're trying to rob or you're doing anything like that where you mix with this hive and you address this hive, you can carry that disease. So you have to immediately report it to the state beekeeper inspector, and he is going to tell you to quarantine that hive. And once he comes and inspects and validates your American foul brood, he's going to encourage you to take a match and light that hive up. That's the only way you can kill American foul brood. You can treat it. They used to think you could take terramycin and treat it, but that really is not a proven success method. And terramycin now is a product that has to be veterinary cleared, so you have to get it from a veterinarian. But honestly, the best thing you can do, if that should ever happen, is to burn the hive after you report it, because it is such a highly contagious disease. Now then, saying that, let me say this. That disease can live in woodware for up to 50 years. So if you buy used beekeeping equipment, you need to be very, very careful. You need to know as much as you can about the beekeeper that owned it, why he's selling, is he had any problems, and a lot of them may not tell you that. So I'm really cautious, very cautious when I go to buy used equipment, especially when it comes to bee boxes, frames, and stuff like that, because that particular disease can live that long in the woodware. And that's why they recommend you burning it. Yes, sir.
You're talking about the used boxes. Now, I've heard that you can take a blowtorch and go on the inside of the hives, that will disinfect them.
You can take and torch them. You can also bleach them with hard bleach. You have to really let them dry out before you, and let the fumes air out before you use those boxes. I'm just going to say this, be really cautious. That's all I can say to you. I do not want to make any beekeeper in jeopardy as far as anything like that, but be very wise and be very deliberate if you're looking at used beekeeping equipment. Yes, sir. I suppose you could. The reason I say that, and the reason I'm dodging that a little bit, like I did with you, is I don't know exactly how much it takes to destroy that disease. We know burning the equipment destroys it, but beside getting to that point, I don't know to what level you have to go to destroy that disease and yet save your woodware. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I've not seen any scientific proof on that yet.
There's not too many organisms that can survive 300 degrees for 3 hours.
And that's correct. That is correct. Yes, sir.
So is there a certain season, if you were to get foul brood, is there a certain season where it would be more susceptible?
I'm going to say that in the late spring, early summer season, it's going to be a little more susceptible. Most of your diseases and pests will become more prevalent in the early summer to midsummer season. Okay? Your pest especially will be that way as well. Terramycin, there's also what they call Tylen, are two medications that have been approved for foul brood. I say that, and let me qualify that. It will not kill the foul brood. It will only keep it from becoming viral, or it'll kind of contain the contagiousness of that particular disease. Now, I said that, all of that, let me say again and reiterate, I've not seen a case of American foul brood in a very long time. A good 10 years. I've heard of a couple of cases in the last 4 or 5. Back in the 70s, American foul brood was a pretty serious problem. But the bee breeders, the beekeeping breeders, have kind of helped our queen situation and kind of bred stronger queens to help that a little bit. And we've basically, because they took such dramatic measures across the board early on, they've kind of seen that eradicated. So we don't see a lot of that issue. I wouldn't worry about that particular disease unless I opened my box and I had a really strong stench that was not familiar. Any questions? Yes. Nobody. So let me say this to you as well. It is against the law now in the United States of America to import bees from any other country. It just is not going to happen. And most countries have become that protective. About 3 years ago, I had the opportunity, was approached about setting up an apiary in Jamaica. And talking with them, we talked about moving forward. So I made a call to the Department of Agriculture and talked to their state bee inspector and asked him the question about where can I get bees? And I told him who I was, where I was from, what they were wanting to do. And I said, can I ship bees in? He said, absolutely not. He said, you'll buy bees from Jamaica or you'll not have any bees at all. So most countries, because the disease issue needs to be contained and protected, are very, very deliberate about being able to import bees from other countries. Now with Canada and Mexico and the borders, it becomes a little challenging. They're not going to let you cross the line, but you know, bees don't know where borders are, so they're going to fly across the lines. A swarm will take off and go, and there's not much we can do about that. But we do try to control that as much as we can as far as a country is concerned. So they're very protective of it. The second disease I want to talk about is called European foul brood. I have never saw a case of this, nor have I ever heard of a case of this. American foul brood attacks the larva. A European foul brood will kill the larva usually before the cell is capped. So when the queen lays the larva in the cell, foul brood, the European foul brood, if it's prevalent in your hive, that cell never gets the opportunity to be capped. That disease will kill it, and it actually uses that larva as food to feed the disease. It can be treated with terramycin. The only way that you can see that you have European foul brood is if you see a lot of cells that are not capped, and you see your larva that has turned, instead of a pure white color, which that larva egg will look like a little piece of rice, white rice, that when European foul brood is present, that larva turns dark brown. And that's a good indicator that European foul brood is an issue. There is not the stench with European foul brood that there is American foul brood. Again, this disease has been pretty eradicated. It's not an issue that I would lose sleep at night over. I am never concerned about this. I don't worry about it with my bees. Questions? Now, here's a disease that you may occasionally see. Usually once a year, I will see this disease from time to time. It's called chalk brood. Chalk brood is a fungus that kills the larva before the cell is capped or immediately thereafter. The larva becomes hard and chalky, and that's how you'll know the chalk brood is present in your hive. What happens is that fungus almost, it mortifies that larva into a chalky, hardened, chalky type larva. The bees will then clean it out of the cell. It'll fall to the bottom, and you'll see it on your landing board. You may see it on the front of the hive where they're trying to clean it out. Little white pieces of what looks to be chalky larva. That's an indication that you might accidentally have chalk brood. The chalk brood actually is mummified. The larva becomes mummified, and it gets cleaned out, and that's when you can actually see it. That again is something that I don't worry too much about, but I do. You know, when I told you early on that when I check my bees, the first thing I'll do is I'll look at the front of my hive and kind of watch. I look for what I'm seeing on the landing board as well. If I see little pieces of what looks like white chalking material, that gives me caution and concern. If I don't see that, if I have the kind of board that pulls the tray out of the back, you see them on the bottom board tray, that white tray, you should have caution and concern. It won't be a commonplace thing. It won't be something that you have to worry about too much, but upon occasion we have seen chalk brood come about, and I'm not sure what creates that fungus unless it's with the exception of a lot of moisture in the season. So if we have a lot of rain in the spring of the year, I think that fungus may be more susceptible to being prominent have the prominent opportunity to be in a hive. Questions about chalk brood? I don't know that there is a treatment. I've not been given a treatment on that. My recommendation is pour the Honeybee Healthy to your bees with sugar water. Do everything you can to create that healthy hive. Al, I don't know if Apistram do you think that would be something that would be effective against chalk brood?
I have very little knowledge of chalk.
Yeah, that's the way with me. It's kind of it's not been a real prominent disease that we've worried about too much. I think it is controllable. It is not contagious, and I think you can address your hive and deal with it. I mean, if you got some terramycin or something like that, maybe some fumagillin or something like that, you might be able to address that and save the bees. The thing that'll happen with chalk brood is it's not necessarily a killer to the worker bee, but if it attacks the larva, what's going to happen to your numbers? They're going to start reducing. You're going to start seeing your hive weaken. So it does need to be addressed, and you do need to get a handle on it, but it's not like the foul broods. It's not something that's going to devastate your hive or totally eradicate your hive unless it's left untreated. And then your numbers are going to dwindle away, and then your hive's going to get so weak that you'll lose them. Okay? Sac brood is another one. Well, I've never seen sac brood. Never. Hear very little about it. It's a virus that prevents the bee larva from turning into pupa. Generally, a few cells are infected. The dried larvae in their larval skins can look as though they have died from American foul brood, but they're more easily removed from the cells. The dead larva usually has their ends pointed straight up. Usually an egg cell will be curled. It looks like it's a half moon laying in the bottom of that cell. With sac brood, that larva will be like almost like standing on its head, it'll appear like. It's not something that I worry about. Not something that you'll probably ever see. In all the beekeeping I've ever done, I've never seen a case of sac brood. Something that we might see from time to time is dysentery. And people confuse nosema with dysentery. Dysentery is a problem when we have a long winter of cold temperatures. If you've raised bees in the past, you know that in November and December when we have cold weather, we get a warm day, you always go down to see if your bees are flying. If it gets over 50 or 60 degrees, that particular day, you'll see that hive really active. What's going on is the bees are taking cleansing flights. They will not defecate inside their hive. The challenge becomes if we have a winter that we have cold temperatures for a very prolonged period of time and they cannot get out and defecate, there is a chance of them developing developing dysentery. And it basically is, for the lack of better words, it's just basically a scour issue with the bees. You'll know that if you have it because the inside of the hive will be splattered with brown streaks. It'll just look like you took chocolate and slung it all over the hive. It'll be on top of the frames, on the top board, the side boards. It can be saved and salvaged if you catch it. I had a case of it 5 or 6 years ago. I had a case of dysentery because we had one of those winters. I immediately, when I recognized what I had, I immediately went for my sugar water and I went for my Honeybee Healthy, and I used a product called Nosavite. Nosavite is a product that will help that. It is an all-natural supplement, and I will tell you in my practice, my pest management practices, in the spring of the year when I start feeding my bees, I use Nosavite and I use Honeybee Healthy and or Amino Boost. Nosavite just simply because I don't want to have any issues with dysentery.
Can you spell that?
Nozevit. It's a highly fortified vitamin pack, where your Honeybee Healthy is more of an amino acid pack, and it takes very little. This bottle will last you for 2 or 3 years. It takes like a quarter of a teaspoon for the quart. So while it may look like $25 is high for this, it lasts forever. And in the spring of the year particularly, or if I've had a real wet fall and I know I'm going into winter with a lot of moisture, I'll use Nosovite there, and that's to protect against dysentery. You also can use a product called Fumagillin. Fumagillin B was really popular back in the 80s. Not so much today because Nosovite is kind of taking the marketplace, but they'll both do the same thing. Okay? Questions? So, yes.
You just feed them in a sugar water type thing?
Yes.
Just a mixture of it?
Yep. So you can mix that with Honey Bee Healthy. When I usually try to start feeding my bees, as I've told you, in February, if I can, because that's when the queen starts laying. There's really challenges with pollen and nectar sources out in the field. So if I can help them along and accommodate them, I do. When I start that feeding program in the spring, it's Honey Bee Healthy with my sugar water and Nosovite, and I usually do the Nosovite for a 30-day period. That's part of my management practice. I also try to do it in the fall of the year. The last thing that I want my bees to have before I close them up is about 30 days of good Honey Bee Healthy. And if I've had a real damp, wet fall, then I'll use the Nosovite in that as well in the fall. So when I had the dysentery, and I'll get you, when I had the dysentery issue, what I did was I went and made me up some sugar water. I loaded it with Honey Bee Healthy and Nosovite, and I literally pulled every frame and just basically drenched it with my sprayer, with that mix. Every frame. I wanted to make sure every bee that I could in that hive got a good dosing of my mix, and that hive came out of it and survived and done well. If I had not, that infected hive I probably would have lost them. They would have probably absconded. You had a question.
Yes, when you feed them in the fall,
Yes.
do you do it in the front feeder, or is that?
I like the front feeders.
Okay.
You can use the top feeders, and I have customers or people, I know people that take the top feeder and leave it on through the winter, and they'll fill it up with 4 gallons of sugar water and their mix and just leave it on, so they have that accessible. But I do it with front feeders because I like to see, it helps me to see what they're taking in, so I can kind of manage that a little better. And there'll be seasons where they'll suck that jar dry in a day or two. When nectar flow starts and there's good pollen sources out there, they'll go away from the sugar water. I don't want them to become dependent on it. I do want to help them, but I don't want a welfare bee that depends on sugar water all year round. And I've seen people that fed them way too much, in my opinion. I want them out in the wild working. That's what they know to do. But in the spring of the year, when that season is critical for the brood, I try to help that situation if I can. So I'm just offering assistance. I'm not trying to control them.
So how often, or how much do you actually feed them?
I'll feed them until I know nectar flow is really good.
So every time the jar is empty? Or?
I'll refill it. Mm-hmm.
You said you start in February?
If I can, yeah. Sugar water typically won't freeze on you on a 1-to-1 mix, but if it gets cold down to minus 23 or something like that, I'm going to be challenged with that, so I'll pull them off. The bees are not going to go into it anyway, and it's that cold. But if we have mild temperatures at 30 and 40 degrees, they'll feed on that. They'll come to that feeder because it's basically tucked in under the hive, and they can get to it okay without a risk of chilling.
Basically, it wouldn't even freeze at 0?
I don't think so. I've never had a jar of it to freeze. Never have. The biggest problem I have with it is raccoons. They'll come up and slap it off of there and drink all that juice. They will. And I've had that to happen. Yes, sir.
Maybe a little off topic, but on that specifically with the raccoons, I was thinking about ratchet strapping down. Is that smart? Putting something heavy on top? Is that a good prevention for raccoons?
What are you ratchet strapping down?
Just the lid over the hive.
Yep, absolutely. I always put weight on top of my hives because those lids in a strong wind will fly off. So I weight them with a brick or a block or something like that. If you want to ratchet strap them down, that's perfect. I mean, if you have bears in your neighborhood, ratchet strapping might be a little more of a deterrent, if it can be. Yes. I've not seen a raccoon get into the inside of a hive, but I have seen them work on jars of sugar water. Anybody else? Okay. Dysentery, we talked about that. There is a disease called nosema. There's actually two forms of it, nosema apis and nosema cerana. It's a digestive system issue with the bees. It interferes with the ability for them to digest food, which obviously causes problems for them and can eventually become fatal for them. It may appear like dysentery, but it's not dysentery. The same as dysentery is not nosema. My encouragement to you is to take this. I don't have a lot of depth in notes on this. Go online and look into it and make sure you have a valid understanding of it. I don't know that I've ever had nosema, but Nosivite will handle and help that as well. And maybe that's why I haven't had it, because I use Nosivite in the spring and sometime in the fall. But it is a disease out there that you need to be aware of. Okay? Questions?
I have one more on that. So whether you see the dysentery or not, you go ahead and treat for it. Okay.
Nosivite is a practice for me. It's part of my integrated pest management program. Spring of the year, first thing out of the gate, Nosivite, sugar water with Honey Be Healthy for sure. And if I want amino boost, it doesn't hurt to put the two together. If the bees had a preference between the two, what I have noticed is they like the amino boost a little better. But the Honey Be Healthy, I've always used it. I've used it for years and got along with it, and I've always liked the results that I saw with my hive. Them bees will come out in the spring of the year when warm weather comes out and they become really active. You'll see a lot stronger hive as a result of taking that step of integrated pest management with the two products or three products. And then in the fall of the year, I want to make sure that my bees are healthy going into the winter. So if I need to take that precaution, I do feed them 30 days prior. I never feed when I have honey supers on my hive. Never. And I will not feed during the summer season unless I have a hive that's really weak and needs help. The nature of the bee is to get out in the field and work, and that's what I want them to do. That's what they want to do. So I don't want to feed them sugar water when they can get nectar flow out in the field. If I catch a swarm, I'll feed them for 2 or 3, maybe 3 weeks. And the two reasons: number one, I want that swarm to recognize that this is now their home and they're comfortable with it and they can take up residence, so they settle in. Number two, I want them to be healthy, so if I can do the Honey Be Healthy, that makes me think anyway that I'm ensuring a little stronger health for that bee. So yes, that's when I use, and honestly, anytime I do sugar water, I'll put Honey Be Healthy in it. So when I'm working my bees, sugar water, I use sugar water instead of smoke, I put Honey Be Healthy in it.
Is the Honey Be Healthy all natural?
Yes. Amino Boost is all natural. Nosivite is all natural. So you're not putting any chemicals into your bees. Any questions? Yes, sir.
This is very elementary. How do I know when nectar is flowing?
So blooming.
It's blooming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything that you see blooming, and you can monitor your blooming seasons You'll see the first things, forsythias are some of the first plants to bloom. From there, once you start to see forsythias blooming, you'll start to see the nectar process start, providing the weather is cooperative. You know, I've seen, well, this year we saw forsythias in bloom and it become freezing weather. Ironically, what I was surprised at last week when we had them cold temperatures and everything was so bloomed out, I thought it would sure enough kill all the blooms. It did not. I was shocked. So my neighbors across the street from me have a big apple tree, and it was just beautiful. I thought, no apples for them. Dadgum tree still got blooms all over it. And I'm like, what is going on? Didn't make sense to me. But blooming season, you'll be able to tell. If you forsythias, move forward from there, providing the weather. Questions? Okay, let's go into pest. This is where it becomes really challenging for us as beekeepers. You will have to be deliberate with this. If you want to be successful, did everybody get one of these? You can have this one, brother. Here's another one right here, brother, if you want it. I'm on a short leash here, so I got to be careful how far I run. Thank you. So that's some reading material for you on some of the pests that we have to deal with. We're going to talk about them, and we're going to talk particularly about the two that you'll have to really be careful with in this particular area. And then we'll talk about some of the others as well. I mentioned early on tracheal mites. Back in the 70s, tracheal mites were a huge issue. The way the tracheal mite affects the hive is it actually attaches itself, infests itself into the trachea of the bee, of the young bees. They breed and, of course, kills them. Years ago, and I say years ago, back in the 70s, you'll read books, you'll see films, you'll see videos back in the 70s. Whenever they got a swarm or a nuke or a package of bees, they dusted them with terramycin powder. That was for tracheal mites. Tracheal mites was a huge issue back then. Today, we don't see that issue as prominent. In fact, I've not seen tracheal mites in 10 years, so we don't see that as being such an issue. It's pretty much been maintained and controlled and eradicated, but back in the 70s, it was as big an issue then as Varroa Mite is to us today. They constantly were having to treat for it. All hives were being treated for it because it was such a devastating issue. If you ever got tracheal mites, one of the things that you would have to do, you can possibly treat it with terramycin or Apistan strips. Apistan strips, in my opinion, is what I call a very hard chemical. It's very hard on the hive. Very hard. So it's hard on the bees. I don't use these unless I absolutely have no alternative method. It's considered a hard chemical for the bees, where a lot of these others like Apivar and HopGuard and those, they're not considered to be a hard chemical. The bees can live with them and get along with them fine. So tracheal mites is something to be aware of. I don't think it's anything that you have to be worried about in the day and age that we live because of the scenario that we're in now. I think it's under control and been eradicated a lot. Also, these queens have been bred to be more resistant. You'll look into these breeds of bees and you'll see like Minnesota Hygienics. They say they're more Varroa Mite resistant or they're more Tracheal Mite resistant. That's where that's come from. Scientists are trying to breed into these bees the ability to ward and fight off a lot of these pests that become such a problem for us today. Questions? Probably not ever going to see a tracheal mite issue. Al, you have, haven't you?
No, I haven't.
You haven't? Not even in the South?
No, as a matter of fact, I left Louisiana in '88, and we didn't. Man, for 10 years, it was just nice.
Yeah. Yeah, the 70s is when it was so bad, and I was trying to think of the guy's name. He wrote the book, first book of beekeeping. You guys, I think, have it. He's an entomologist at the University of Georgia. And in that little book, the first beekeeper's book, you'll see him in there. He wrote that book, very great man, but you'll see him in there dusting these hives, the nukes that he's buying, or his hives. That was written back in the 70s, and that's why you'll see him dusting them, is because tracheal mites was such an issue. Terramycin powder back then was one of the methods they used to control or to help eradicate that particular issue in their hive. So the big one that we need to spend a lot of time on is Varroa mites. If you're going to have bees, you have got to take steps to protect yourself against the Varroa mite. I gave you, how do you like the front cover of that pamphlet there? I was a little bit of overkill on that bee, but I thought, you know, if you're like me, you throw your papers down in a stack, that one will stand out and you'll always be able to find it. So you see on that particular bee, that brown spot on his back, that is a Varroa mite. Those Varroa mites usually attach themselves to the underside of the honeybee. On occasion, and you can see it with the naked eye, on occasion you might see one attached on the back side, upper side of the honeybee. It's a crab-like mite that attaches itself by piercing the skin and the adult bee, and they actually act as a vector for that particular bee. The challenge with the Varroa mite is they get into your brood chamber, and that's where they breed and they multiply inside your hive. They also absorb your larvae. So swarming with your all-natural beekeepers, they want their bees to swarm because you have a 3-week break in your brood chamber. That queen doesn't lay for 3 weeks, so it breaks the cycle of brood, which helps lower the Varroa mite population and helps safeguard a little bit against the Varroa mite. I'm not going to do this justice, I can tell you that right now. This is a pretty serious issue. The Varroa mite pupates in the ground. That's why we talked about nematodes. That's why we talk about Guardstar and spraying around your hives. And you can spray the ground around your hives. I would do it late in the evening when the bees have gone back in. Usually with sprays, it's a 3-hour dry-in period, so if it has overnight to dry in, you'll be safe and not worry about poisoning or causing any issues with your bees. Guardstar is a great product to use to help fend off or to safeguard against not only the Varroa mite, but the hive beetle as well.
What was the name?
I'm sorry?
What was the name of that again?
Guardstar. The Varroa mite does fly, so it can transport itself from hive to hive. Now, the key to it is, how do we take measures to protect ourselves against the Varroa mite? To understand the Varroa mite, typically what we see in season is in early summer, you'll begin to see somewhat of maybe the Varroa Mite show up. As the summer progresses, the infestation gets stronger until we get into fall. And if a hive is left unchecked, when we get into fall, what happens is the hive starts dueling down in numbers to prepare for winter, overwintering. The queen will quit laying in late September, 1st of October. So as the worker bees die off, there will be a segment of bees that will remain through the winter months. And how they know to do this, I don't know, but her last laying sessions, if I can use that terminology, will be bees that will exist through the winter season to protect the hive. That's how come they're a perennial bee, because they'll overwinter, they'll keep her warm, they'll keep the hive warm, so when spring comes, she's ready to go back to work. But all of the rest of the worker bees, the drones, they're out of the hive. They dwindle down into a small cluster to overwinter. What happens there is the Varroa Mite count doesn't dwindle down. And if it's unchecked or untreated, what will happen is, because there's so many Varroa Mites come winter, your hive, you'll think they've done great going into the winter. Come spring, gee whiz, I don't have any bees. They've absconded. They will abscond and leave that hive because they're overwhelmed by the population of the Varroa Mite. So my practice, and this is just me, please, in the fall of the year, I always want my honey flow, the best that I can time-wise, to be pulled by the 1st of September. The reason for that is in September you have particular flowers that bloom, that the bees will work, that has somewhat of a distaste in honey. And I don't want it in my honey, and I'm sitting here trying to think of what that plant is. Thank you. Goldenrod. When goldenrod blooms, the bees will work it, but it does not give you a good tasting honey. It'll have a little bit of a bitter twang. So I rob my bees about the 1st of September to prevent that, especially if I've got honey with my honey supers. At the same time, I will try to do my pest management for Varroa Mites. I use and have used for the last few years Apivar strips, and have got along very well with it. Apivar strips have to be left in the hive for a period of like 43 days. Takes 2 strips per box. I space them out between the frames, stick them in there, usually go to the middle of the box, and I'll do 2 frames, go down to the next box and do 2 frames out from that, so that they're just not lined up in a straight line in my hive. I'll leave them for 43 days. Sometimes I have left them all winter, so they're not going to hurt your bees. If you get into a cold snap and you can't get back into your bees, once the 43 days, there's no disadvantage to taking them out. It's not going to hurt the bees, number one. Number two, I'll do more damage to the bees getting into cold weather opening that hive than I would otherwise. So there has been winters that they've stayed in all winter long. The other thing that I do in February, if you'll remember me telling you, I had an older gentleman tell me one time that there was always 7 warm days in February. If I can catch one of them warm days in February, I'll go back again and put more new Apivar strips in my hive. Now, please know that it has to be at least 60 degrees or better for me to get in and break my boxes open. What I have found, if I do Apivar strips in the fall and do it again in the spring, you may say, well, that's really not necessary if you've done your job in the fall. These are not 100% conclusive, okay? The most effective method out there is oxalic acid. It has a tendency to be 95 to 100% effective. A lot of them say 97 to 98% as a rule. Apivar is not going to hardly be that high. But Apivar is not as invasive to the honeybee and to the hive as what oxalic acid can be. Oxalic acid has to be used strictly by the directions. So you apply only the amount that it recommends. If you overkill it, you're going to hurt your bees and you're going to jeopardize damaging your bees. That's why I stay on the safer side, and you can use this, or you can use ApiGuard, or you can use HopGuard. Read the directions, see what the longevity is for it to be in the hive, and follow the rules. Follow the directions that it gives you. When I go back into my hives in February, I'll do another round of Apivar. What I have found is in doing that, my bees come out of the spring a lot stronger. And that gives me the assurance that I have pretty much eradicated the Varroa Mite in my hive for the spring season, which is the busiest time for that hive in its operation. I know that come summer, it's going to start to cycle all over. I can't stop that. So I have to be proactive and treat it the best that I can. My encouragement to you is not take me at face value. If you want to look at HopGuard or Checkmite or ApiGuard, look at those products. See how they operate. See what fits your program better. Apivar has just worked well for me. So I've used that and got along with it great.
How long have you been using that in years consistently?
So I've been using Apivar for the last 4 or 5 years. I know where you're going with that. Will that hive build up a resistance? The answer to that could be yes. But you need to think about this. That worker bee lives 6 to 8 weeks. So I am constantly treating a new cycle of bees. So it's not the same bees getting cycled and treated year after year after year. Same with the queen. If my queen and my bees swarm, I've got a new queen this year. I'll have a new queen next year if the cycle continues like I allow them to continue. Is that where you were going with that?
Yeah, because I've always felt that there was a little bit of resistance to be built up. But as you said in the beginning, you ask the same question to 10 beekeepers, you get 11 different right answers.
And I'm not saying he's not correct. I can see that valid point and would say that it could be very wise to switch on occasion and go to HopGuard or go to ApiGuard or something like that, just to break up the monotony and the consistency of what you've been doing. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Actually, I have two. One, you said like around the summertime that the Varroa Mite will start picking up again. Would it make sense to treat them then before they ever get started going again in the summer?
Well, you have to be careful because if in the summer times when I usually have my honey supers on, and I can't treat during that. Now, one of these products, HopGuard, you can, but honestly, I'm old school. I don't know that I trust that.
I got you. And the second question is, you said this is the Varroa Mite didn't used to be an issue, but it's become an issue. Where did it come from? How did it become such a problem?
That's a good question.
No answer.
No answer.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that, honestly. That is a very good question. How did they come to be? What happened to cause that? It could possibly be like the new danger that we're dealing with, the Asian hornet, that they've come from overseas, migrated this way. We don't know that. And I don't know the answer to that source. But they are a huge issue. Yes, ma'am.
This is a dumb question, but say you treated your hive and the queen is exposed to this Apivar, would she in theory be more prone to lay resistant bees to the mites?
I don't know that there's any scientific study to validate that.
Okay.
Basically, what the chemical, and these are, I think Apivar is an all-natural. Most of these are all-natural products. ApiGuard is a Camphos, I think. No, it's thymol. So you can use a thyme oil, and be creative as far as building your own treatment. basically the job of these is to kill the Varroa Mite, not necessarily to build the breed of your bees.
So on our existing hive, is it too late to do a treatment in April?
So have you gotten into that hive yet?
We did.
Okay.
You'll be, I'm sure, speaking on the hive beetle, because we found.
You got them, haven't you? So let me ask you this. What is the condition of the hive as far as brood and honey stores, etc.?
We found brood, we never did find the queen, but we found brood, and I saw them, did you see honey in there? I think so.
So the big question would be, how long do you think it will be before you put honey super on that hive? So I'm asking you about the room you've got.
We took the super off after you told us they move up.
Mhm.
We found out, yes, they do.
Mhm.
We took the super off.
Okay.
So I would say they have to build up another super.
So you got 2 boxes on?
Yes.
Are both boxes full?
Or- No.
The bottom
Our
box?
brood box is what I meant to say.
Okay. So you got 1 brood box or 2?
We have 2.
And the top box is full, the bottom box is empty?
No, we switched it.
You flipped them, good. So they've got the top one to fill out.
Yes.
So you've got 43 days, let's just say 45 days that it'll take to treat with this. Excuse me. My guess is, yes, you have time. As long as, so they weren't treated last fall.
They were. We actually had a friend who was a newbie
Mhm.
tell us he had someone come over and do the oxalic acid.
Mhm.
That's what we did.
Okay,
And we did that in October, was it? September, October.
okay.
So we did treat them last year.
So to answer your question, yes, you probably have time to treat them if you want to. Yeah.
And Dan, there's a couple of the treatments that are over there, Formic Pro, and I can't remember the other, Mite something. Those are only 2-week treatments. You do them in 14 days.
Right, right. Formic Pro is a relatively new product. I'm not familiar with that. I think Apiguard is like a 30-day type treatment. And I've seen Apiguard used. I'm a little challenged with Apiguard. Oh, you boys. I'm going to tear your... Apiguard is a tray that you set on top of your box. And I'm not sure that I'm convinced that it's the most effective based on that method of application. The Apivar, I stick it down in the frame, and I just take, it's got holes in the top of it. I just take a toothpick, stick it through there, let it hang on the toothpick in between the frames, one here and one here, and then do the bottom box the same way. I would do both boxes,
So
4 strips all together. Yeah, and I've got along fine with it. But please research the other ones. There might be something that you like better. Oxalic acid has Randy Oliver developed oxalic acid out of California. Great, great beekeeper. There is a number of applications for oxalic acid. The most common that we see used is the dribble method, where you put 5 cc's in a syringe and go down the frame, and it drips over the frame down onto the bees. You have to stay within the recommendation of the directions. Don't overdo it. There also is the method of taking a cloth and soaking it in oxalic acid, laying it across the top of the frames. There's also the Vaporizer Method. You guys have the Vaporizer over there now. And to me, when I saw that Walter Kelly company, I went to their field day about 5 years ago, and oxalic acid had just came out, and the Vapor Method had just came out. They closed up that hive, stuck that hose there, and they charged that thing. And I'm like, holy crap, man, I don't want to do that. I thought it was the most invasive thing I'd ever seen with a hive. So I was really nervous about that particular method. But a good friend of mine, Tom Pluth, down at Highlandville, he's used the dribble method for 4 or 5 years and got along with it beautifully. And if you have a bottom board tray like this, where you can pull that bottom board out, the tray out, you can literally see the effectiveness of it. And it'll, instead of being white, it'll almost be dark from the numbers of the Varroa Mite killed. Now, you can test your hive. There is a method you can test your hive to see if you have how strong a population of Varroa Mites you have. You can take powdered sugar in a jar, like a tablespoon of powdered sugar, get you a handful of bees, put them in the jar, seal it, roll the sugar on the bees. What happens as you roll it with the powdered sugar, the Varroa Mite will fall off. And when you look at the count after that, when you take the lid off, them bees going to be a little feisty, but you can get a count and an idea of what kind of population of Varroa Mite you have in that hive. Yes. Okay, you're resting there. So there are some things you can kind of do, and that's why this tray is kind of an effective method and become more popular, because you can pull that whiteboard out and you can kind of see what's going on inside that hive. Yes, ma'am.
Do you suggest that sugar method over the alcohol testing?
Not familiar with the alcohol testing. That's new to me.
That's what all the videos say, and they kill the bees.
What you do is you take about a cup of bees. You're gonna get about 300 bees. They're gonna kill them. And you take your alcohol, put them in, get you some of that wire, get you a mason jar lid, and put it on there. So when you slosh them around, take your coffee filter, and when you pour them out, you're gonna see the mites on that coffee filter. Sometimes they hide. I've always used the powdered sugar before. The alcohol wash works pretty good, and you count your mites and see where you're at. You will lose about 300 bees.
I'm not an advocate of killing my bees, so I probably will use the powdered sugar.
Well, I've never heard of the
Me
powdered sugar.
neither. That was a great.
Yeah, you should see it online as well. Powdered sugar roll.
Everybody online does the alcohol.
Really?
I've not seen them put it in a jar, but I've seen them just dust powdered sugar over the top of the hive
Mm-hmm.
to have them groom it off
Yep.
and then count the bottom.
And you can do that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Now, you had that book up there written by one guy that's all natural or something you showed us last week.
Mhm.
Now, I read the book too, and he was talking about you can go and take powdered sugar and sprinkle it over your frames and just let, or he even said garlic salt.
Garlic salt.
He said, you know, well, he said in his book, he said, Italian bees love the garlic salt.
That's funny. That's good.
He said it also has a anesthetic value to it too, to help ward off diseases and stuff like that. The garlic salt. It's in the book.
I'm going to write. I need to read the book.
Could you use garlic powder?
Well, it could have been garlic powder, I guess. Maybe it was instead of salt.
We better read the book.
It's garlic powder, I'm not, you know.
So there's a lot of information online that you can go to and find out. The Fat Beekeeper, Randy Oliver. Randy Oliver has a website. He's become really well known for his ability with oxalic acid. Great guy. And there's a lot of opportunities you can take and find to help ward or integrate into your management program against the Varroa Mite. When I looked at the map this morning or yesterday, I looked at the map just to see how much population there was of Varroa Mite across the United States. The entire United States was red.
Wow.
So there's not going to be any escaping it. We have just got to make that a part of our management practice. Okay? Any other questions about the Varroa Mite?
We were just thinking.
Go ahead.
That maybe you just need to treat and not, why would you count the mites unless you were having a problem? Just if you keep treating for them, that's about all you can do, right?
Yeah. Again, it's being proactive instead of reactive. Okay. Let me tell you a little story. It's been about 4 years ago. When I would go down, it's been 5 years ago. I worked for Nixa Hardware at the time, their beekeeping department. We had sold a bunch of packaged bees, 3-pound packaged bees. Luke and I, a friend of mine, we would go to Georgia to Drapier's Apiary to pick up the packaged bees. We got down there, we always wanted to pick them up about noon so we could hit the road and drive all night and be here the next morning. So they didn't hardly have all the bees ready, so we were kind of milling around there a little bit, and the owner of the apiary, Dan Drapier, he came around and I got to meet him and we were chatting, and I said, how many hives do you guys have here? 40,000. I said, really? Well, I got over my head right there, you know. And I said, well, so I had had an undated amount of calls that year about bees absconding. So I said, so how many hives do you lose through the winter from bees absconding or anything? He said, I don't lose bees to absconding. I said, what? He said, no. He said, if we lose 20 hives, we've had a bad winter. I said, how you doing that? He said, I treat. I said, you use Apivar? He said, all 40,000 hives. He said, when bees abscond, and I told him what was going on up here, he said, it's Varroa Mites. If they're absconding, it's Varroa Mites. They need to be treating their hives. I'll never forget that story, and I'll never forget the opportunity to sit down with him and talk to him about that, because it was just a method that they had ingrained in their business as part of their management program, and it was tried and true. And I thought to myself on my way home, if it works for him, my 10 hives can surely do the same thing. So for what it's worth, there you have it. Some of these apiaries, these big apiaries, they have to take management practice programs as well. And one of the most successful habits you can have as a beekeeper is to be proactive and not reactive. Reactive, you're always behind the 8 ball and you're always trying to catch up. So implement into your management practices so that you're proactive with your hive and your hive stays healthy. Okay? Any questions? Yes, sir.
What about those drone frames?
Drone frames have been used as well and used with success. I didn't bring a drone frame over, and I should have. The thing you'll see about the drone frame is they're a larger cell. The Varroa Mite loves those cells to get in there and get into the larva. And you take them out, put them in, leave them in for, is it 3 weeks? I think you leave them in the hive for like 3 weeks. You pull them out, shake the bees or brush the bees off of them, put that frame in the freezer, and it'll kill all of that Varroa Mite larva that's growing in those drone frames. That's been a successful method. And you have the drone frames over there.
They'll be plastic and they're
Green, kind of a lime green color. Okay, anybody else? Let's take a break before we get into the hive beetles, because we're going to be there for a minute or two, and we'll go from there. 10 minutes.